The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the day Bessie Hale had decided would be the last ordinary day of her life. She was standing in the middle of the parlor of the Hale family home in Dusk Creek, Texas, the year 1878, wearing the ivory dress her mother had spent 3 weeks sewing by lamplight, when the rider from the postal route threw the envelope through the open window like it was nothing more than a piece of trash. It landed on the oak table beside the vase of dried wildflowers, and Bessie stared at it the way a person stares at a rattlesnake that has somehow found its way into a warm room. The name on the front was written in a handwriting she did not recognize, but the seal pressed into the wax was unmistakable. It belonged to the Bristol family ranch, 40 miles north. She should not have opened it. She knew even then, with her hands trembling and the wedding 1 week away, that she should have set it on the mantel and walked back to the kitchen and let her mother keep talking about flower arrangements. She should have let Reverend Calloway post the banns without disturbance. She should have let herself become Mrs. Gerald Whitmore without ever knowing what that letter contained. But Bessie Hale had never once in her 22 years been able to leave a secret unopened. She broke the seal, and everything she thought she knew about her future, about Gerald Whitmore, about the man she was about to promise herself to before God and the whole congregation of Dusk Creek Baptist Church, cracked down the middle like dry timber hit by lightning. The letter was from Matthew Bristol. She had met him exactly once. 14 months ago, at the county fair in Harrowfield, where she had been selling her mother's preserves, and he had been standing at the edge of the livestock pen, watching a bay horse with the kind of quiet, steady attention that she had found herself watching him with for the better part of an hour before she even realized what she was doing. He was tall, lean, dark-haired, with sun-bronzed hands and eyes the color of creek water in autumn. He had bought a jar of blackberry preserves and said precisely 4 words to her. "These are worth something." She had thought about those 4 words for 14 months. She had not known, when she later agreed to marry Gerald Whitmore, that Matthew Bristol was the reason she had hesitated so long. She had told herself it was practicality. Gerald was established. Gerald had land and a house and a solid reputation in town. Gerald had asked her father first properly, and her father had shaken his hand and called him a fine man. And Bessie, who had grown up watching her family scrape through hard winters and dry summers, had told herself that love was a luxury and security was a necessity. She had almost believed it. Then she opened the letter, and Matthew Bristol's words dismantled every carefully constructed wall she had built around her practical heart. He wrote like a man who had been holding something back for a very long time. He wrote that he had known, the day they met, that something shifted in him that he could not explain or undo. He wrote that he had stayed away because he had heard she was spoken for, and he had respected that the way a man respects a fence line even when the land beyond it looks like heaven. He wrote that he would never have broken his silence, never have put pen to paper at all, except that 3 days ago a man named Curtis Doyle had ridden onto the Bristol ranch and tried to sell Matthew a stolen land deed. The deed was for 40 acres adjoining the Whitmore property. And when Matthew had turned it away and looked closer at the documents Doyle had dropped in his haste to leave, he had found something that made his blood go cold. Gerald Whitmore was not who he said he was. The land Gerald had shown Bessie's father, the prosperous acres stretching south from the creek, did not legally belong to Gerald at all. The deed was fraudulent, the title manufactured from whole cloth. More than that, there were letters among the scattered papers, letters in Gerald's hand, addressed to a woman in San Antonio named Clara Voss. The letters were tender. They were recent. They described Clara as Gerald's common-law wife and spoke of a plan to secure the Hale land through a legal marriage, then transfer ownership within the year under a provision Gerald had apparently had a lawyer draft in secret. Bessie was not being courted. She was being trapped. She read the letter 3 times. Then she sat down on the parlor floor in her ivory wedding dress and pressed the back of her hand to her mouth and breathed through the betrayal like it was smoke, like she was trying not to choke on it. Her mother called from the kitchen. "Bessie, are you trying on the veil?" "Yes, Mama," she said. Her voice came out perfectly steady, which surprised her. She had 1 week. She had 1 week to decide what to do with this information. 1 week before she walked down the aisle of Dust Creek Baptist Church and signed her name to a document that would hand her family's land to a man who had a secret wife in San Antonio and fraudulent papers, and a plan that treated Bessie Hale as nothing more than a key to a door he wanted unlocked. She folded the letter. She pressed it flat against her chest. She thought about Matthew Bristol's handwriting, which was careful and deliberate in the way of a man who did not write often, but wrote honestly when he did. She thought about his creekwater eyes and his 4 quiet words and the fact that he had ridden through 14 months of silence and driven 40 miles worth of risk to tell her the truth when he could have said nothing. And she thought, I do not know this man at all. I met him once. He could have his own hidden motives. This letter could be a different kind of trap. She was not a woman who trusted easily. That was the first thing anyone who knew Bessie Hale would tell you. She was warm and she was capable and she laughed at the right moments and helped her neighbors without being asked. But at the center of her, where the soft things live in most people, Bessie had built something harder and more watchful. Her dark past with trust had begun when she was 16, and a man she had believed to be a family friend had tried to swindle her father out of their best field through a handshake agreement that no judge would have honored. She had been the one to catch the deception. She had been the one to confront it and fix it. And she had decided then that the world contained 2 kinds of people: those who told you the truth because it cost them something, and those who told you something that looked like truth because it cost them nothing. Matthew Bristol's letter had cost him something. She could feel the weight of that cost in every careful, honest line. She stood up from the parlor floor. She smoothed the ivory dress. She walked to the window and looked out at the flat, sun-scorched Texas landscape, at the hardpan road running north through the scrub brush and the live oaks, at the sky that was the same pale, relentless blue it had been every day of her life. Then she made a decision that would change everything. She was going to ride to the Bristol ranch. Bessie did not tell her mother where she was going. She changed out of the wedding dress carefully, hung it on the hook behind her bedroom door, and put on her riding skirt and her cotton blouse and her boots, which had been resoled twice and were honest in the way that old boots are honest. She took the roan mare from the stable, saddled her herself, and was out of the gate before the heat of the day fully descended. The ride north took 4 hours. The Texas hill country in late spring smelled of cedar and dry grass and the ghost of recent rain, and Bessie let the landscape work on her the way it always had, letting the bigness of it press the panic down into something more manageable. She went over the letter in her mind again and again. She went over what she knew of Gerald Whitmore and tested each piece of it for cracks. She found more cracks than she wanted to. The times he had deflected when she asked about his family. The lawyer he always mentioned without ever naming. The way he had moved so quickly from introduction to proposal, as if there were a deadline she did not know about. The way he had shown her father the land but never offered to walk the deed down to the county recorder's office. At the time she had taken these for the ordinary evasions of a private man. Now they assembled themselves into something with intent. She arrived at the Bristol ranch at 2:30 in the afternoon. It was a working spread, immediately evident from the condition of the fences and the state of the barn, which was weathered but tight and well-maintained. A hand she did not know looked up from the corral as she rode in, and she asked for Matthew Bristol in the most ordinary voice she could produce. The hand disappeared into the barn, and a moment later Matthew Bristol walked out into the sunlight. He was exactly as she remembered, and the fact that she remembered him so precisely after a single meeting and 14 months told her something about herself that she was not entirely comfortable with. He stopped when he saw her. Something moved through his face that he did not try to conceal. It was not surprise exactly. It was more like a man who had sent a message into the dark and was watching the lantern come back. "You came," he said. "You wrote me a letter full of very serious accusations," she said from the saddle. "I am not the kind of woman who receives serious accusations and sits quietly at home." He nodded. "Get down. I will get you some water. Then you can ask me everything you need to ask." She got down. She tied the mare to the post. She followed him to the porch of the ranch house, which was a simple, solid structure with a wide overhang and 2 wooden chairs. And she sat in one of those chairs, and he brought her water in a tin cup, and she drank it without ceremony while he settled into the other chair and waited. "Show me the papers," she said. He had them inside. He brought them out and laid them on the low table between the chairs, and Bessie spent 40 minutes going through every document, every letter, every scrap of evidence that Curtis Doyle had dropped on the Bristol property 3 days ago. She was methodical about it. She was not hasty. Her father had taught her to read a land deed when she was 12, and she read these the way he had taught her, looking for the signatures that should be there and the ones that should not be. The fraud was not even particularly sophisticated. A man with enough legal knowledge to draft convincing language, but not enough care to ensure the signatures matched the recorder's records. The Whitmore deed was registered to a Gerald Clarence Whitmore in Dusk Creek, but the registered owner at the county recorder's office in Harrowfield, she suspected, would be someone else entirely, or no one, or a fiction. The letters to Clara Voss were worse. They were tender and specific and utterly damning. They described Bessie by name, referred to her as the daughter with the land, spoke of the Hale property as the prize. There was a passage in one letter that made her jaw tighten so hard her back teeth ached. Gerald had written, "She is a practical girl. She will not require much convincing. Her family needs the security and she knows it." She set the letter down. She kept her hand still by pure force of will. "He thinks I am desperate," she said quietly. Matthew Bristol was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He does not know you." The simplicity of that statement, the directness of it, cracked something small and tight open in her chest. She did not look at him. She looked out at the fence line and the brush beyond it. "I need to know why you wrote to me," she said. "You had no obligation. You could have kept this to yourself or brought it to the sheriff and left my name out of it entirely." He was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved through the live oaks at the edge of the property, a dry, raking sound. "I could not leave your name out of it," he said finally, "because it is your life they are talking about, those letters, your family's land, your future. I could not know what I knew and let you walk into it without a choice." "That is a good answer," she said. "It is the right kind of good answer, the kind that does not ask for anything back." "I am not asking for anything back," he said. She turned and looked at him directly for the first time since she had sat down. He was watching her with those Creekwater eyes, steady and without pretense, and she felt the 14 months of distance collapse into something uncomfortably immediate. "I need to think," she said. "I need to decide what to do about Gerald Whitmore and how to do it in a way that protects my family without exposing them to a legal battle they cannot afford." "I can help with that," he said. "If you want help, I am not offering it as a condition. I am offering it because it is right." She stood up from the chair. She looked at the papers on the table. She thought about her father's face, about her mother's 3 weeks of lamplight sewing, about the ivory dress hanging on the hook behind her bedroom door. "I will be back tomorrow," she said. "I need one night to think clearly." He nodded. He walked her to the mare and untied the rope from the post, and when he handed the reins to her, their fingers were close without touching, and she was aware of that distance the way you are aware of the heat from a fire even when you are not standing close to it. She rode home in the long, golden light of the late afternoon and said nothing to her mother except that she had gone for a ride to clear her head, which was not a lie. That night Bessie lay on her bed in the dark and built a plan. She was not a woman who crumbled. She was not going to crumble now. What she needed was certainty, legal certainty, and she needed it fast. The county recorder's office in Harrowfield was a day's ride, and if the Whitmore deed was fraudulent, The recorder's records would show it. She needed a witness. She needed someone with legal standing who could help her bring this evidence to light in a way that protected her family from Gerald's potential retaliation. And she needed to untangle herself from this engagement without letting Gerald know she was untangling until the moment it was too late for him to act. That last part was the most dangerous. A man with a hidden plan and a fraudulent deed was not going to accept being exposed quietly. She thought about what Matthew had written about Curtis Doyle, the man who had dropped the papers. She thought about what kind of man took a stolen deed to sell, and what kind of connections a man like Gerald Whitmore would have in a town he had only recently moved to. She thought about all of it until about 2 in the morning, when she finally slept. She was back at the Bristol ranch by 10 the next morning with her plan laid out in her head like a map. Matthew was at the corral when she arrived, working a young horse with a long rope, his movements patient and consistent. He saw her coming down the road and handed the rope to the hand standing nearby, and by the time she reached the gate he was there to meet her. "You slept," he observed. "Not much," she said, "but enough. I have a plan and I need your help." They sat at the porch table again with the papers between them, and Bessie laid out what she needed, step by step, without flourish. She needed to ride to the Harrowfield recorder's office to check the deed. She needed Matthew to come as a witness, because a woman arriving alone with a disputed land document would be dismissed by half the officials in the territory without a second thought, and she was not going to let practicality become pride's casualty. She needed to do this in the next 2 days. And she needed, when the moment came to confront Gerald Whitmore, for that confrontation to happen in the presence of the Dust Creek sheriff, whose name was Amos Greer and who she had known since she was a child and who was, she believed, a fundamentally honest man. Matthew listened to all of this without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "I can ride to Harrowfield tomorrow. I can take the papers and you take the copies I made this morning." He produced a second set of documents, carefully reproduced in his same deliberate handwriting. "I did not know if you would need them, but I thought it was wise." She looked at the copies and felt something move through her that was warmer than gratitude and more complicated. "You thought ahead," she said. "I have been thinking ahead since Monday," he said, "since the moment I found those papers." There was a pause between them, the kind of pause that is full of things neither person is quite ready to say. "Why Monday?" she asked. "The county fair was in March of last year. You have had 14 months. He looked at her steadily. "Because in March of last year you were not engaged to a man trying to steal your family's land. I had no reason to come to you then. That would not have been purely selfish. And now I have a reason that is not purely selfish," he said. "So I can come to you, and it is the right thing and not just the thing I want." The honesty of that hit her somewhere below the practical, watchful part and found the softer thing underneath. She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke her voice was even. "We leave at first light," she said. "I will tell my mother I am visiting my cousin in Harrowfield. She will believe it. She has no reason not to." He nodded. "I will have the horses ready." She rode home again, and that evening sat across the supper table from her mother and her father and listened to her father talk about the wedding, about the preparations, about how Gerald Whitmore was going to expand the south pasture in the fall, and she kept her face very still and her voice very ordinary, and she thought, "I am going to save you from this, Papa. You do not know you need saving, but I am going to save you." The lie about the cousin visit held easily. Her mother was pleased, even, because the cousin in question, Alina, had a new baby and Bessie's mother had been wanting her to visit. She packed Bessie a small bag of preserves to bring and told her to come back by Saturday, which gave them 2 days. They rode to Harrowfield together the next morning with the papers in Matthew's saddlebag and the copies in Bessie's, and for the first hour of the ride neither of them spoke very much. The landscape moved around them, the same flat land and cedar breaks and distant limestone hills that Bessie had known all her life, and she found that riding alongside Matthew Bristol was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence two people share when they are both thinking seriously and neither needs to fill the air with noise. At some point, she asked him about the ranch. He told her about it without either false modesty or excessive pride. His father had died 4 years ago and left him the land, which carried a small debt that he had worked off in 3 years through a combination of cattle sales and horse trading. The horses were his particular skill. He had a reputation in the county for being able to read a horse's temperament faster than anyone else, which she had already suspected from watching him at the corral. She told him about her family's land and what it meant to them. Her grandfather had broken that ground in 1851, she said, when the county was nothing but open range and borderland, and the kind of dangerous uncertainty that required a particular species of courage to survive. Her father had kept it through drought and depression and 2 cattle plagues, and the thought of Gerald Whitmore sitting at her family's table for Sunday dinners and looking out over that land with eyes full of the hidden motive of eventual theft made her feel something so fierce and protective that it pressed against the inside of her ribs like a physical force. "He looked at you the same way," Matthew said quietly, "like something he intended to acquire." She glanced at him. "You saw that from one meeting at a county fair." "I saw it," he said. "I did not know what to do with it then. I told myself it was not my business." "What changed?" "The papers," he said. "They made it my business whether I wanted it to be or not." They reached Harrowfield in the early afternoon. The county recorder's office was a squat limestone building on the main street between the general merchandise and the telegraph office. And the recorder himself was a man named Hal Petty who wore paper cuffs and reminded Bessie of a dried seed pod, small and brown and faintly rustling. But he was precise and he took the inquiry seriously, and when Matthew laid the disputed Whitmore deed on his desk and asked him to cross-reference it with the official registry, Hal Petty pulled out his ledger books with the careful dedication of a man who took tremendous personal offense at falsified paperwork. It took him 40 minutes. He came back to the counter with 3 ledger pages and a look on his face that was equal parts professional outrage and bureaucratic satisfaction. "The property described in this deed," he said, tapping the document with one papery finger, "was sold in 1875 to a trust registered in San Antonio by a party named Arthur Voss. Arthur Voss is deceased. The trust is currently managed by his daughter, whose name is Clara Voss." He looked up. "This deed you have brought me has been fraudulently backdated, and the signatory is forged. The man whose name appears as the current owner has no legal claim to this land whatsoever." Bessie felt the confirmation land like a stone dropping into still water. The ripples went out in all directions. "I need a certified copy of that finding," she said. Hal Petty looked at her over his paper cuffs with something like respect. "I will have it ready within the hour," he said. They sat outside on the bench in front of the recorder's office and waited, and the Texas sun in the late afternoon was a deep honey color that made the dust of the street glow. Matthew was beside her, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him. "Clara Voss," Bessie said quietly. "The land he showed my father belongs to her through the trust, and she is his common-law wife. He was going to steal from her too, essentially, by using her property as collateral for a marriage he intended to control." "He was stealing from everyone," Matthew said. "You, your family, Clara Voss, everyone in the radius of whatever he wanted." "Men like that," Bessie said, "have been operating in this territory since before the war. The frontier makes it easy because the records are incomplete and the land is vast and the courts are slow. My grandfather used to say that the West attracted 2 kinds of people, those who came to build something real and those who came because the distance between honesty and consequence was wider out here." "Your grandfather sounds like he was worth listening to," Matthew said. "He was the best man I ever knew," she said, and the past tense of it settled over her the way grief does when it is old enough to be gentle. When Hal Petty came back with the certified copy, Bessie took it, folded it carefully, and placed it in the inner pocket of her riding jacket, close to where the letter from Matthew had been that first day. She thanked Hal Petty with genuine formality. He told her to bring it to the county sheriff's office and that he would file a secondary report from his office within the week. They spent the night in Harrowfield, at separate boarding houses on either end of the main street, which was the only proper arrangement and which neither of them questioned. But at supper, at the hotel dining room where they ate across from each other at a small table with a tin lamp between them, the conversation moved away from Gerald Whitmore and the fraudulent deed and settled into something quieter and more personal, and Bessie found herself talking to Matthew Bristol the way she talked to very few people, with full honesty, without the protective layer of careful distance. She told him about her 16th year, and the man who had tried to cheat her father and how it had made her distrustful of ease, of smooth approaches, of men who presented themselves too cleanly. She told him that Gerald Whitmore had always felt slightly too smooth and that she had told herself that was her own excessive caution at work. She had overridden her instincts and she would not do that again. Matthew listened without commentary until she was finished. Then he said, "I am glad your instincts are sharp. I am also glad you are willing to examine them when you think they might be wrong. That is rare." "You are not a particularly smooth man," she observed. He almost smiled. It was the first time she had seen him close to smiling, and it changed his face in a way that made her breath catch in an embarrassing manner. "No," he agreed. "I have been told that." "I consider it a strong recommendation," she said. He looked at her across the lamp, and the honesty between them was so direct and so unhurried that it felt like a completely different landscape than anything she had experienced with Gerald Whitmore, who had always made her feel subtly managed, subtly steered, always arriving at destinations she had not quite chosen for herself. "When this is resolved," Matthew said carefully, "I would like to call on you properly, if that would be acceptable to you. I am not asking you to decide anything now. I am telling you that I intend to ask, because I think you deserve to know the full extent of what I am thinking rather than having it arrive as a surprise later." The formality of it, combined with the absolute sincerity underneath, made her want to laugh and cry simultaneously, which she recognized as a dangerous sign. "Ask me again when Gerald Whitmore is no longer engaged to me," she said. "But I will tell you now that the answer will probably not be no." He nodded once, gravely, as if she had confirmed something important. They rode back to Dust Creek the following morning, and the ride felt different from the ride out, lighter in some fundamental way, the kind of lightness that comes not from problems being solved, but from the fact that the right person is riding beside you while you solve them. They arrived at Dust Creek in the mid-afternoon, and Bessie went directly to the sheriff's office. Amos Greer was a man in his 50s with a steel-gray mustache and the careful, considered manner of a man who had seen enough human foolishness to be neither surprised nor rushed by any new variety of it. He had known Bessie's family since her father was a young man. He listened to her account with his hands flat on the desk in front of him and his eyes fixed on her face, and when she laid out the certified copy from the recorder's office and Matthew's collection of original papers, he went through them the same methodical way that Bessie had. When he finished, he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. "Gerald Whitmore has been in this town for 14 months, he said. "He has been a model citizen. He has not given me a single reason to look at him twice." "I know," Bessie said. "That is how it works." Amos Greer looked at her, then at Matthew standing quietly beside the desk, then back at Bessie. "I'm going to need to send a wire to San Antonio," he said, "to verify the Clara Voss situation. I'm not going to move on Gerald Whitmore until I have confirmation from the Texas Rangers or the district court that this deed fraud is prosecutable under territorial law, because if I move too soon and he knows we are coming, he will disappear and take whatever evidence he has not already scattered." "How long will that take?" Bessie asked. 3 days, maybe 4. "The wedding is in 4 days," she said. Amos Greer met her eyes. "I know," he said. "That is why I am sending the wire tonight." She thanked him and stood and walked out into the afternoon heat of Dust Creek's Main Street, and for a moment she stood on the boardwalk and breathed the cedar and dust air, and felt the enormous strangeness of her situation. Her wedding was in 4 days, and her fiance was a fraud, and she was standing outside the sheriff's office with a man she barely knew who was the most honest person she had come across in a very long time. Matthew came out of the office behind her. He stood beside her without speaking. "I need to go home," she said. "I need to behave normally for 4 days, which is going to require significant effort on my part." "You are capable of it," he said. "Do not flatter me." "I'm not flattering you," he said. "I have watched you handle 2 days of legal warfare and complicated betrayal with the steadiness of someone who has been preparing for this kind of fight her whole life. That is not a compliment, that is an observation." She looked at him sidelong. The afternoon light caught the angles of his face. "Go back to your ranch, Matthew Bristol," she said. "Amos Greer will send you word when the wire comes back. Keep those original papers safe." "I will," he said. "Bessie." He said her name like it was a word that deserved some weight behind it. Be careful with him. Men who build traps know when the trap is being examined. She felt that warning settle into her spine. "I know," she said. She rode home. She put the roan mare back in the stable. She went inside and helped her mother with supper and listened to her father discuss the weather and the price of beef. And across the table Gerald Whitmore was not there because he did not eat at their table every night. He called twice a week, and this was not one of his nights. She had 3 days before she would have to sit across from him and look at his smooth, unrevealing face and know what she knew and say nothing. She thought about the people in those letters. Clara Voss in San Antonio, managing a trust in her dead father's name, entangled with a man who had signed himself her common-law husband while simultaneously courting a woman in Dust Creek for her family's land. Whatever Clara Voss's circumstances were, Bessie felt a cold solidarity with her, the solidarity of women navigating a world built by men who assumed women's blindness was permanent. Gerald came on Thursday evening for supper. Bessie wore her second-best dress and helped her mother set the table and sat across from him and watched him. She watched him the way she had never watched him before, with the secret knowledge of what she knew pressing behind her eyes like a headache. She was keeping very still. She watched how he spoke to her father with practiced deference. She watched how he described the South pasture and the plans for it with the fluency of a man who had rehearsed ownership so long he had started to believe it himself. She watched his hands, which were smooth for a ranching man, smooth in the way that hands are smooth when they have not actually done ranch work. She had noticed this before and told herself it meant nothing. Now it meant something. He turned to her at one point and said, "You seem quiet tonight, Bessie." She smiled at him. It was the most controlled performance of her adult life. "I'm just tired from the ride to Aliner's," she said. "The baby keeps unusual hours." He accepted this without question. Of course he did. He had no reason to think she was anything but the practical, uncomplicated girl he had written about to Clara Voss, the girl who did not require much convincing. After supper, when her father walked Gerald to the gate, Bessie stood on the porch and watched his silhouette in the dark and thought, "You built a trap. You chose the wrong woman to put in it." On Friday, the wire came back from San Antonio. Amos Greer sent a rider to the Hale farm with a note that said simply, "Confirmed. Come Saturday morning early." Matthew Bristol had been copied on the wire and would be there. The sheriff had also requested the presence of Dust Creek's justice of the peace, a man named Oliver Fitch who handled legal documents and had the authority to void a fraudulent engagement contract under Texas law if the circumstances warranted. Bessie spent Friday night sitting at her window looking at the dark land that had been her family's for 30 years, and she prayed with the blunt sincerity of someone who was not particularly sure about God, but was very sure about the land and the people on it. She prayed for her father's dignity, because she knew this would wound him, the knowledge that he had been played for a fool. She prayed for her mother, who had sewn that dress by lamplight. She prayed, with a private and slightly guilty gratitude, for Matthew Bristol and his 4 quiet words and the letter that had arrived on a Tuesday and changed every plan. Saturday morning arrived with a clear sky and a wind from the northwest that smelled of distant rain. Bessie dressed carefully, not in the wedding dress but in her best day dress, dark blue with white collar, which her mother had made her for church Sundays. She went to her parents at breakfast and she told them, quietly and carefully, that there was something important happening at the sheriff's office this morning and she needed them both to come. Her mother looked at her face and seemed to understand without words that whatever was happening was serious. Her father looked at her and then looked at her mother and then stood up and said, "All right, Bessie, let us go." They rode into Dust Creek together. Gerald Whitmore was expecting to meet them at the church for a final meeting with Reverend Calloway about the ceremony, which was tomorrow. He did not know the meeting had been changed. When they arrived at the sheriff's office, Matthew was already there, standing outside with his hat in his hands in the way of a man who had been waiting quietly and was not bothered by waiting. He looked at Bessie when she rode in, and she looked back at him, and in the exchange of that look was something uncomplicated and strong that she found herself grateful for. Her father looked at Matthew Bristol with the expression of a man who has seen something unexpected in a familiar room. He had not known Bessie was spending time with this person. That conversation was coming, but not yet. Amos Greer brought them all inside. He had the wire from San Antonio on his desk beside Matthew's original papers and the certified copy from Harrowfield. He explained the situation to Bessie's father with the careful, factual manner of a man who respected his audience and was not going to dress up a betrayal with soft language. He laid out the fraudulent deed. He laid out the letters to Clara Voss. He laid out the confirmation from San Antonio that Clara Voss was indeed in a common-law marriage arrangement with a man matching Gerald Whitmore's description, who was also known in San Antonio under a second name, which was Harrison Vane. Bessie's father's face went through several things in rapid succession. He looked at the papers, he looked at Amos Greer, he looked at Bessie. His jaw worked. "He was going to steal from us," he said, not a question, a statement that he was testing the weight of as he said it. "Yes," Amos Greer said. Bessie, her father turned to her. "How long have you known?" "Since Tuesday," she said. "I needed the legal confirmation before I brought it to you. I did not want to give you something that might be wrong." He was quiet for a long time. Her mother had her hand on her arm and was looking at the documents with the expression of someone who is very controlled and very angry at the same time. Then her father looked at Matthew Bristol, who had been standing quietly by the wall the whole time. "You found this," her father said. "The papers came to my property by accident," Matthew said. "But once I saw them, I had no choice about what to do with them." Her father studied him for a moment with the measuring look of a man who had been assessing people's character across fence lines and handshakes for 30 years. Then he gave a single, slow nod. Gerald Whitmore arrived at Amos Greer's office 40 minutes later, having been sent for by a deputy with a message that said there was a matter regarding the wedding documents that required his signature. He came in with the pleasant, unhurried confidence of a man who expected to manage whatever he found. He was wearing his good coat. He had a gold watch chain. He looked like every inch of what he had pretended to be. He stopped when he saw the room. He looked at Bessie. He looked at Amos Greer. He looked at the papers on the desk. And the smoothness left his face, not all at once but in layers, the way paint peels off a wall that has been wet for too long. "Sit down, Mr. Whitmore," Amos Greer said, "or whoever you are." What followed was not pleasant and it was not brief, but it was thorough. Gerald Whitmore, whose real name turned out to be Thomas Gerald Harrison, which was how he had signed the letters to Clara Voss, maintained his pretense for approximately 10 minutes before the weight of the certified recorder's finding, and the corroborated San Antonio wire made maintaining it unreasonable. He shifted then to a kind of cold, stripped-down pragmatism, negotiating terms, talking about misunderstandings, speaking to Amos Greer over Bessie's head in the way of a man who still believed that the women in the room were incidental to the proceedings. Amos Greer stopped him twice to include Bessie in the conversation directly, which was something she noted and appreciated. In the end, Thomas Gerald Harrison was taken into custody pending charges of deed fraud and misrepresentation, and would face further legal proceedings through the district court involving the Clara Voss Trust complication in San Antonio. Oliver Fitch, the Justice of the Peace, formally dissolved the engagement under fraudulent pretenses provisions, and Bessie's father signed the document with a hand that trembled only slightly. On the walk out of the sheriff's office into the clear Saturday morning, Bessie's mother stopped on the boardwalk and looked at her daughter with an expression that contained everything a mother looks like when her child has been in danger she did not know about. "You handled this," her mother said. "We handled it," Bessie said, and she looked back at Matthew Bristol, who had come out behind them. Her father was looking at Matthew too. He extended his hand. Matthew took it, and her father shook it with the gravity of a man who was settling more than one account. "I would like to hear more about you," her father said to Matthew Bristol. "I suspect that is going to be a worthwhile conversation." "Yes, sir," Matthew said. "I am available whenever you would like to have it." Bessie stood in the middle of Dust Creek's Main Street on that clear Saturday morning with the engagement she had made in desperation formally dissolved and the fraud exposed and the land safe and her family around her, and she felt something enormous and clean moving through her, like the first deep breath after a long illness. She looked at Matthew. "You said you would ask me again," she said quietly, so only he could hear. "When it was resolved." He looked at her steadily. "I did say that." "I am telling you that the answer is not going to be no," she said. "When you ask." Something moved through his face then, something warm and real and unhurried, and that not-quite smile appeared again, and this time it went all the way to his eyes. "Then I will call on you Monday," he said, "with your father's permission." "My father," she said, glancing back at the man in question who was very carefully pretending not to be listening, "appears to be favorably disposed." She rode home with her parents, and the ivory dress was taken off its hook that afternoon and put away in the cedar chest where her mother stored the things that needed to wait. Her mother was quiet about it, but it was not a defeated quiet. It was the quiet of a woman resetting the story she had been telling herself and finding that the new version had more possibility in it. Monday arrived. Matthew arrived. He rode up to the Hale farm at 10 in the morning, clean-shaved and straight-backed, and asked to speak to her father in the front room while Bessie occupied herself in the kitchen with a pretense of baking that fooled no one. The conversation lasted 25 minutes. At the end of it, her father came to the kitchen door and said, with a dignity that could not entirely conceal his approval, "Bessie, Mr. Bristol would like to speak with you on the porch." She took off her apron. She went to the porch. Matthew was standing at the railing looking out at the land, and when she came out he turned, and in the morning light with the cedar-scented air around them and the whole wide Texas sky overhead, he said without preamble and without performance, "Bessie Hale, I have thought about you for 14 months, and I would like to spend a great deal more time thinking about you with your full awareness and consent. I am asking if I may court you." She looked at him for a long moment, this careful, deliberate, honest man who had ridden 40 miles with dangerous documents to give her a choice she had not known she needed. "Yes," she said, "you may." What followed was the courtship that Matthew Bristol had promised, which was unhurried and genuine, and conducted in the full light of day rather than the hidden corners of someone's agenda. He came to the Hale farm twice a week, always in the evening when the work of the day was done, and he sat on the porch with Bessie and talked the way they had talked on the road to Harrowfield, with the same quality of honest, unperformed conversation that she had never quite found with anyone else. He brought her father horses to look at, because he had learned quickly what her father loved, and the two men developed a friendship over horseflesh and land that was its own separate and genuine thing. He showed her the ranch in stages, as if he were introducing her to something he cared about and wanted her to see properly. The horses first, because those were the heart of the place. He had 12 of them in various stages of work, and he moved among them with the same quiet patience she had watched from across a county fair pen 14 months ago. She began to understand that his way with horses and his way with people came from the same source, a deep, unhurried attention that did not flinch from difficulty, but did not rush it either. She showed him the Hale land in the same way, walking the fence lines with him, showing him the creek that ran through the southern edge, the old pecan grove her grandfather had planted, the small graveyard at the northwest corner where her grandfather and 2 of her father's siblings lay under rough limestone markers. She showed him these things not as a presentation but as a sharing, and he received them with the care they deserved. They talked about the injustice of what had nearly happened, not just to Bessie, but to Clara Voss in San Antonio, who was, by all available evidence, also a victim of Thomas Gerald Harrison's particular brand of long-distance manipulation. Amos Greer had been in correspondence with the San Antonio authorities, and word had come back that Clara Voss had, upon learning the full extent of Harrison's activities, provided additional evidence to the Rangers that significantly strengthened the fraud case. She was, it appeared, a woman of some considerable intelligence herself, and Bessie found herself hoping that Clara Voss had people around her worth trusting. "The world is full of men who treat women as instruments," Bessie said one evening on the porch, the late summer sky going orange and purple overhead. "Pieces in a plan they are running. It is not always as dramatic as Gerald Whitmore. Sometimes it is smaller and slower and harder to name, but it is the same thing." Matthew was quiet for a moment. "The best argument against it is women like you," he said, "who refuse to be instruments." She looked at him. "And men like you," she said, "who refuse to treat them that way." He reached over and took her hand, which was the first time he had done so, and he held it with the same steady, deliberate care he applied to everything, and the warmth of it moved through her from her palm upward and settled somewhere permanent. The summer moved through its long, hot arc and into the first cool touches of fall. Bessie and Matthew were not rushing anything, and the not rushing had a quality to it that she had not anticipated, a richness that came from each moment being chosen rather than obligatory. She had spent years feeling slightly managed by her circumstances, slightly arrived at destinations she had not fully chosen. This was different. Every step of this she was choosing herself. She learned his history in pieces, the way you learn a landscape when you walk it slowly. He had grown up on the ranch, the only child of parents who had both been quiet, self-sufficient people. His father had taught him land and horses. His mother, who had died when he was 15 of a fever that swept through the county one particularly harsh winter, had taught him to read carefully, to write honestly, and to consider before speaking, lessons that had shaped him so thoroughly that they were no longer lessons, but simply the way he was. He missed her still, in the way of someone who had never quite been able to replace the particular quality of understanding she had given him. And when Bessie watched him talk about his mother, she understood something about why he had moved through 14 months of wanting to find her, and not acting on it until acting was clearly the right thing. He had been raised by a woman of deep integrity, and he had internalized her standards so completely that he applied it to himself with full rigor. This was, Bessie thought, either the most admirable thing about a person or the most infuriating, and in Matthew Bristol's case it was somehow both, which she suspected was going to keep things interesting for a very long time. October came. The pecans in the grove were dropping, and the air was sharp and clean and smelled of turning leaves and far-off smoke. Matthew came to the Hale farm on a Thursday evening, later than usual because he had been finishing a fence repair that had taken longer than expected, and he sat down on the porch bench still smelling of cedar and honest work, and Bessie sat beside him and leaned into the warmth of him without thinking about it first, which was new. He was quiet for a long time, comfortable in the way he always was in silence. Then he said, "I have been thinking about what I want to ask you." She went still. "I have been trying," he said, "to decide if I am asking because the time is right in some calculated way, which I do not think is the right reason, or because it is simply true, which I do believe is the right reason. And I have concluded it is simply true. I love you, Bessie. I have known it was going to be love since 14 months before I knew your name, which is the most inconvenient and irrefutable experience I have ever had. I would like to marry you. Not because of land or practicality, or any reason that a person would write about in a letter to a secret contact somewhere else. Just because I love you and I want to spend the rest of my life having the kind of conversations we have on this porch and the kind of silences we have on long rides, and I want to help you build whatever it is you are building." She had been holding her breath without realizing it, and now she let it out in a long, slow exhale into the October air. "That," she said, "is by some distance the finest thing anyone has said to me in my entire life." "I have been composing it for several weeks," he said, with the closest thing to vulnerability she had heard from him. She turned to look at him fully, this honest, patient, infuriatingly careful man, and she thought about the ivory dress in the cedar chest and the fraudulent deed and the letter that had arrived on a Tuesday and the long ride to Harrowfield and the look on his face when he said her name like it had weight. She thought about the 14 months he had waited without asking, and the 1 week when asking became the only right thing to do. "Yes," she said. "Matthew Bristol, yes." He looked at her with the Creekwater eyes, and the warmth in them was so direct and unguarded that she felt it like sunlight. Then he kissed her, there on the porch in the October evening with the pecan trees dropping their nuts in the dark and the stars beginning to show overhead, and it was exactly what she should have expected from a man like him. Honest and unhurried and entirely certain of itself. Her father, who was indeed not entirely failing to notice events from behind the kitchen window, went and told her mother, who made a sound of profound satisfaction and immediately began thinking about flowers. The engagement was announced the following Sunday at Dusk Creek Baptist Church, and the congregation of people who had been preparing themselves for a wedding 2 months ago, and then been very confused by the sudden cancellation, now reassembled themselves around this new development, with the cheerful flexibility of a community that enjoys a good resolution. Reverend Calloway shook Matthew's hand and told him he had heard something of the story and considered it providential. Amos Greer, who was there with his wife, gave Bessie a look of deep, uncomplicated approval. The date was set for the following March, which gave them 5 months, and Bessie's mother took the ivory dress out of the cedar chest and looked at it carefully and decided, after some consideration, that a new dress was warranted. This one would be made from fabric that Bessie chose herself, a deep cream with small embroidered flowers at the collar, which was a better dress for the person she was now than the one she had been trying to become when she first put on the ivory. Those 5 months moved in a different quality of time than the summer had. They were busy months, full of practical things, the combining of 2 adjacent properties into a shared future, the long conversations about how the horse operation and the Hale cattle could complement each other, the negotiations of 2 families becoming one extended unit. Bessie's father and Matthew spent long evenings at the kitchen table with maps and ledger books, and Bessie sat with them often, not as an observer but as a full participant, because Matthew had made it clear from the beginning that any plan involving her land and her future would be made with her at the table. Her father had taken to this expectation at first with slight surprise and then with something approaching relief, as if he had always wanted a daughter who sat at the table and had simply been waiting for the right circumstances to make it natural. Bessie and Matthew argued occasionally, as honest people do. Once, rather fiercely, over the question of whether the south pasture should be used for the horse operation or kept for cattle. She held her ground. He held his. They went 4 days without resolving it, during which they were both perfectly civil and completely unmoved from their respective positions, And on the fifth day, Bessie arrived at the Bristol ranch with a hand-drawn diagram and a 4-point argument that she delivered without preamble. And Matthew listened to all 4 points and was quiet for a long time and then said, "You are right about the water access. The south pasture is better for cattle." And that was that. She found the experience enormously satisfying. He found it enormously satisfying too, though he would have described it differently, as the discovery that having a partner whose thinking you respected made every decision, even the lost arguments, better than any decision made alone. March arrived. The weather held, a thing you could never count on in the Texas Hill Country in March, but it held, and the day of the wedding was bright and cool with a sky like polished silver. The church was filled with the whole of Dust Creek's population, and several people from Harrowfield who had made the ride, including Hal Petty, the recorder, who had written Bessie a congratulatory note that she found both touching and slightly formal. Matthew's friends and neighbors from the surrounding ranches filled the right side of the church. Bessie's family and community filled the left. Bessie wore the cream dress with the embroidered collar and carried a small bunch of cedar and early wildflowers that she had gathered herself that morning, and she walked down the aisle of Dust Creek Baptist Church on her father's arm with the full, clear knowledge of what she was walking toward. Not a plan someone else had laid for her, not a trap disguised as security. Her own freely chosen, fully known, absolutely certain choice. Matthew was standing at the front of the church in a dark coat that fit him as if it had been made for him, which it had, by the tailor in Harrowfield, and he was watching her come down the aisle with an expression on his face that contained everything he had ever said to her, and a great deal more that he had not yet said. And when she reached him and took his hand, the warmth of it was the same as it had been on that October porch and would be, she understood, for the rest of her life. Reverend Calloway read the words that had been read in this church 100 times before, and they stood under the vaulted wooden ceiling with the March light falling through the tall windows, and they said the things they meant with full honesty, which was the only way either of them knew how to say anything. They were married. The community of Dust Creek erupted into the kind of celebration that small communities mount when a story has come out right, with long tables of food on the church green and fiddle music and dancing that went on past dark. And Matthew Bristol danced with his wife, slowly and not particularly skillfully, which she found so perfectly characteristic of him that she laughed against his shoulder, and he looked down at her, and his expression was the full, warm, uncomplicated happiness of a man who has not often let himself be entirely happy, and is finding it, now, to be the most natural thing in the world. They settled into the ranch together, which they had spent the winter expanding to hold both of them properly, adding a second room off the main house and a covered porch on the east side where the morning sun came first. The Hale farm remained in Bessie's family, worked now by her parents with her younger brother helping, and she and Matthew rode over twice a week at minimum, which meant that the two properties functioned as a loose, extended unit rather than separate concerns, and Bessie found this deeply satisfying, the way that good solutions are satisfying when they honor the full complexity of what they are resolving. In the summer of their first year, word came through the Dust Creek post office that the case against Thomas Gerald Harrison had been resolved in the district court. He had been convicted of deed fraud, misrepresentation, and 2 additional charges that the San Antonio proceedings had added. The sentence was 10 years in the state penitentiary, with additional civil liability to the Voss Trust. Clara Voss had recovered the land in question, and according to the brief follow-up correspondence Amos Greer shared with the Bristols, was managing the trust in her own name now, which Bessie read about and felt the same cold, determined solidarity she had felt reading those letters for the first time. She wrote Clara Voss a letter. She did not know if it would be welcome, but she wrote it anyway, because it seemed right. She introduced herself and said briefly that she understood something of what Clara must have navigated, and that she hoped the resolution had left her free to build the life she deserved. She did not expect a reply. But 3 weeks later, a letter arrived from San Antonio in a careful, educated hand, and Clara Voss wrote back. The correspondence continued irregularly over the following years. Two women on opposite ends of Texas who had been caught in the same man's web and had both, in their different ways, gotten themselves free. The first fall of their marriage brought the first frost early, which was hard on the range but good for the cedar, and Bessie and Matthew sat on the east porch in the early mornings with coffee in tin cups watching the frost burn off the grass as the sun rose. And these quiet mornings became one of her favorite things. The unhurried companionship of two people who had chosen each other with full knowledge and were finding, day after day, that the choice had been exactly right. The horses were doing well. Matthew had developed a steady trade with ranches across 3 counties, and his reputation had grown to the point where buyers came to him, now rather than requiring him to travel to fairs. Bessie, who had spent her life watching her family's margins, applied herself to the ledger side of the operation with the same methodical intelligence she applied to everything. And within 2 years, the Bristol ranch was operating with a financial stability that neither of them had quite imagined possible. Her father came to look at the ledgers once, invited at Bessie's suggestion, and she sat at the table beside Matthew while her father went through the accounts and watched the expression on her father's face move from polite interest to genuine respect. He closed the ledger book and looked at his daughter across the table and said, "You are your grandfather's girl," which was the highest thing he could say. She was 8 months into the following year when she told Matthew, on the east porch in the early morning, that the Bristol operation was about to expand by 1 human person. Matthew went completely still. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she had not seen before, something open and unguarded in a way that was beyond even his usual honesty, something that was pure, uncomplicated wonder. "Are you sure?" he said. "I am very sure," she said. "I have been sure for approximately 6 weeks. I wanted to be more sure before I told you, because I know how you feel about premature announcements." He made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something more serious, and he reached over and took her hand the same way he had on that October porch 2 years ago, steady and certain, and held it. "I am very pleased," he said, which was such an insufficient description of what was written on his face that she laughed. "I can see that," she said. "I am also afraid," he said with the same honesty. "Because the thing that matters most to you can also hurt you most, and I have no framework for the scale of how much I want to protect you from that." Looked at him in the early morning light. "Matthew Bristol," she said softly, "we are going to be all right." He looked at her. He believed her. That was one of the fundamental things about him, that when Bessie Hale Bristol told him something with certainty, he trusted it, not blindly. He had simply learned over 2 years of close and honest living that her certainty was built on real foundations. The baby came in December, a cold, clear December night with stars sharp and close overhead. Matthew was there, because she had told the doctor that he would be there and she would not argue about it, and the doctor, who knew Bessie Bristol, did not argue. It was a boy, solid and loud from his first breath, and Matthew held him in the doorway with the lamplight falling over them both, and Bessie watched from the bed, exhausted and fierce and overwhelmed with a love so large it had no edge she could find, and she thought, This is what the choice was leading to. Not just this child, not just this man, but this life, built by honest hands on honest ground. They named him James for Matthew's father. The middle name was John for Bessie's grandfather. James John Bristol came into Dust Creek's awareness in the way of all babies in small communities, which is to say immediately, and with significant opinion from everyone involved, and was found satisfactory by all parties. Bessie's mother came and stayed for 3 weeks, and the house was full in the way that small houses full of good people are full, crowded and warm and too loud at mealtimes and entirely right. Matthew navigated it with the same patient flexibility he brought to horses and arguments and the complications of honest living, and Bessie watched him be a father the way she had watched him be everything else. with full attention and full commitment and no performance whatsoever. James was a bright, noisy child who turned out to have his father's attention for animals and his mother's way with a problem, which combination promised an interesting future. He was followed, 3 years later, by a daughter they named Margaret, for Matthew's mother, who arrived in the spring, and was from the first day a person of strong and specific opinions, which her parents found both alarming and deeply familiar. The years settled into their pattern, neither easy nor hard in any extraordinary way, simply the full, grounded living of two people who had built something real. There were bad winters and good harvests and horse trades that went well and one that went badly, and a drought in the third year that tested everyone on the range and a flood the year after that tested them again. Through all of it, the thing that held was the thing they had built on purpose: the honesty, the shared table, the East Porch mornings with coffee in tin cups, the arguments settled by evidence and patience, the way they moved through difficulty together rather than around each other. Bessie thought sometimes about the Tuesday the letter arrived, the ivory dress and the fraudulent deed, and the 4-day ride that followed. She thought about it not with bitterness. The bitterness had been brief, and she had not fed it because she had not had time, but with a kind of clarified gratitude for the precise mechanics of how the truth had moved from Matthew Bristol's hand to her parlor table at the exact moment when her life still had time to change. A week later, and the change would have been so much harder to make. A week earlier, and she might not have been ready to receive it. She had thought sometimes, in the first months after the wedding, about the question of what she would have done if the letter had never come. If Thomas Gerald Harrison's instrument Curtis Doyle had never dropped those papers on the Bristol property, would she have gone through with the wedding? Would she have discovered the fraud some other way? Or would she have been the practical girl Gerald had calculated on, too focused on security to look hard at its foundations? She did not know. She thought she would have found it eventually, because she was who she was and she had built too sharp an eye for the crack in the foundation to have stayed blind forever. But eventually could have been years into a life already signed over to the wrong person, and the thought made her grateful all over again for the accident of fate that had put those papers in the path of an honest man. 5 years after their wedding, Bessie and Matthew rode to the county fair in Harrowfield together with 4-year-old Margaret on the saddle in front of Matthew and 7-year-old James, riding his own horse beside them, a gentle bay that Matthew had trained for him specifically, and they set up at the same spot near the livestock pens, where Bessie had sold her mother's preserves once upon a time. This year she was selling her own preserves, alongside a display of information about the Bristol horse operation, and James was beside her with the proud, proprietary air of a child who considers himself a business partner. Matthew was at the livestock pen. He was watching a horse with the same quiet, steady attention she had watched him with that first day, and she looked at him across the crowded fair ground with the warm, easy knowledge of who he was and what they were to each other. And the look he gave her when he glanced over, the particular look of a man who has located the most important thing in a crowded room, made her feel exactly as it had the very first time. She thought about those 4 words across a jar of blackberry preserves. These are worth something. She had understood then, even without knowing it consciously, what he had been telling her. Not about the preserves. She was worth something. The life she was going to build was worth something. The truth that would eventually arrive was worth something. And it had been. In their 11th year together, when James was 10 and Margaret was 7 and a third child, another boy they called Thomas Robert, known universally as Robbie, was 3 and a definitive force of nature. The Bristol Ranch had grown to be one of the most respected horse operations in the Texas Hill Country. Matthew had been asked twice to testify as an expert before the County Land Commission on questions of property value and animal trade, and Bessie had taken over the management of the combined Hale-Bristol accounts at her father's request when her father's eyesight began to fail, a role she performed with the same clear-eyed precision she brought to everything. They had built a life together that was the direct product of honesty, and Bessie felt this on the ordinary days as much as the marked ones. Felt it on the Tuesday mornings when they sat across from each other at breakfast with the children loud around them, and the coffee going cold, because nobody had had a moment to drink it. And Matthew looked at her across the chaos with the creekwater eyes and the ease of a man completely at home in the life he had chosen. Felt it on the Sunday evenings when the children were in bed, and the house was quiet, and they sat on the east porch with the stars coming out over the cedar breaks, and talked about nothing in particular in the comfortable, unguarded way of two people who have been telling each other the truth for so long that it requires no effort anymore. One evening in the quiet of their 12th year, Bessie went to the cedar chest at the back of the bedroom and lifted the lid and looked at the ivory dress folded there between two sachets of dried lavender. She had not looked at it in a long time. It was still beautiful, still intact, still the product of 3 weeks of lamplight sewing. She smoothed her hand over the fabric. Matthew was in the doorway. He had heard the chest open. "The ivory dress," he said. "My mother made it," she said. "I could never bring myself to take it apart or give it away. It was made with love, regardless of what it was made for." He came and stood beside her and looked at the dress in the chest. "Margaret will want it someday," he said. Bessie looked at the dress and thought about her daughter, who was 7 years old and already remarkably determined and remarkably herself. "She will want it," she agreed. "And she will wear it for exactly the right reason, and it will have been worth waiting for." She closed the cedar chest. She stood up. Matthew was there, the lamp behind him warm and close, and she looked at him the way she looked at him on all the ordinary days, with the full knowledge of who he was and the full, unhurried gratitude for every step of the path that had brought them to this room, this life, this quiet evening with their children asleep down the hall and the stars over the cedar breaks and the east porch waiting and the coffee still warm in the pot. She had agreed to marry someone else. The letter she received had changed every plan. It had shattered one future and built from the pieces something far more real. "Come sit on the porch," Matthew said. "Yes," she said. "Let us go sit on the porch." They went out into the Texas night together, and the stars were clear and close and very bright, and the cedar and dry grass air that she had breathed every day of her life moved around them, and they sat in the porch chairs with the same ease they had carried into every year of this life they had made, and the silence between them was the deep, full, unhurried kind that belongs only to people who have told each other the truth long enough and completely enough that they no longer need to fill the air with anything except what is real. Dusk Creek went on around them. The land went on. The Bristol horses slept in the barn, and the children slept in the house, and Bessie Hale Bristol sat beside the man who had ridden 40 miles with the truth when he could have said nothing. And she was grateful for every single piece of how this story had gone, from the letter on the parlor table to this clear and ordinary and completely right evening, and she would be grateful for it every day of her life. She reached over in the dark and took his hand. He held it steady and certain, the way he held everything worth keeping, and that was enough. It was more than enough. It was exactly everything.